Welcome to Module 7, Choosing Responses. This next video will describe choosing responses, and by the end of this whole module, students should be able to develop good response options for their questions. So one of the first things that you think about when you are considering a question is whether or not you will choose to have it answered as a closed-ended or multiple choice answer, or an open-ended response. For closed-ended responses, respondents are given standardized responses to choose from. Response options should be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. If respondents can choose more than one response, then the format option should be separate yes/no questions. Closed-ended response options are easy for respondents to complete and easy to analyze, but it limits the response options. You'll also need to keep the responses short, precise, and objective. You'll want to consider providing an other category and a please specify option because people will want to give more detail. This may frustrate some respondents, however, who really want to provide you with more context, in which case open-ended responses may be preferable. Open-ended responses are a good way to find out what people think. It requires that people write out or verbally present their responses, but you can use probes, prompts, and aided recall. It takes more time to complete for respondents, and it will take more time for the survey researcher to code and analyze these data. Coding of open-ended responses may also not be consistent unless you train your coders well. I'd like to illustrate some of the advantages and disadvantages of each type of question format. A comparison of questions about gun control measures appears on this slide. For closed-ended responses, you might ask a question like, "Are you in favor of gun control measures?" with the response options of yes, no, and not sure. The closed-ended question is easy to complete and analyze, but it limits the response options, so it may frustrate respondents if they would like to provide more context to their answers. But open-ended questions will also take you longer to collect, clean, and analyze. And if you have more than one person trying to code the results of open-ended questions, you might actually introduce some bias into your results unless they are well trained regarding the coding of open-ended responses. An example of mutually exclusive and exhaustive responses appears in this slide. How old were you at your last birthday? Less than 15 years old, 15 to 29, 30 to 44, 45 to 59, and 60 years or older. Anyone answering the survey will belong in one and only one of the response groupings. When people can fall into more than one category, as in a self-identified race question, then you should allow respondents to choose multiple answers as appropriate. The best way to do this is to provide the responses as separate yes/no response options. In addition, if you can't list all races in your survey, then provide people with an other category where they can self-identify. Finally, for a question like race, where some people may consider this sensitive information, you should consider offering people the option not to answer the question. You may consider using aided recall in an interview survey. In aided recall, you first ask the respondent a question and transcribe the response, and then provide specific options to elicit a more detailed response. For example, you might say, "During the past week, which sources have you used to learn about what was going on in the news?" So the answer might be something like the New York Times phone app. But then, after the respondent provides that answer, the interviewer will proceed to list a number of other sources, such as daily and weekly newspapers, news magazines, local and national on-air television, etc., and then ask the respondent to provide a yes or no response to each source that they list. The next thing to consider is response option formatting. This is a general health question which is frequently used in health surveys. In general, would you say your health is excellent, very good, good, fair, poor? Unfortunately, the two examples of formatting provided here are confusing for the respondent and would be poor choices for a self-administered survey on paper. Rather, it is preferable to use a vertical format for this type of question. Although it does take more space, it is very clear that if you circle the number 1, you mean that you are saying your health is excellent. It is easier to interpret the response options. It is unlikely that the respondent will choose an incorrect response, and it will be easier for data entry for paper surveys. Of course, it is possible to use a horizontal format when a set of questions are all answered using the same response categories, or when you're using an ordered scale, sometimes called a Likert type format. An example of an acceptable horizontal form is provided with the CAGE scale for measuring alcohol dependence. The question starts by asking how many days in the past 4 weeks have you had at least a little to drink. Notice how specific this question is, even providing how many days in 4 weeks. Then respondents are asked to circle one response for each of the remaining questions. And if you format your question carefully, you can even use a horizontal format for the general health question that we looked at earlier in the video. With the use of boxes, it should make it easier for the respondent to provide a clear response to the question. Finally, for open-ended questions, be sure to provide enough space for respondents to answer your question. If you provide too little space, respondents will assume that you really aren't interested in what they have to say. To summarize, rely more heavily on closed-ended questions for self-administered surveys. Use more open-ended response options for interview surveys. But remember, open-ended response options will require coding by more than one survey staff member for consistency, and then reconciling their coding. For more detail on how to code open-ended questions, see the guidelines that are posted in Module 13, Data Coding Rules.